realize the urgency of this situation, and that we expect that to happen quickly after the Vaccine Advisory Committee. But it would be really inappropriate of me to prejudge what comes out of that committee. That's an independent committee, and also whether there's additional data that would be needed or additional analysis. So at this point, we expect to move quickly afterward, but I can't make any estimate as the amount of time at this point.
Okay. Well, sorry if I got that wrong on weeks. Do you have a sense of whether or not it's accurate to assume that there will be a vaccine approval in December?
So we are very hopeful of that, and we are moving quickly. And as I just said, Jeff, for sure, we have all hands on deck, and we expect to move very quickly after the Vaccine Advisory Committee. But as you can imagine, this group of independent experts will review the data that we provide them, the data that will be public, the meeting that will be public, all in the interests of informing the public and transparency. And so don't want to prejudge that situation at all.
And just for transparency and for people who don't understand how this works, what will the FDA scientists be doing after that meeting to make this determination?
So we'll be reviewing all of the comments, and of course it'll be done in real time, but afterward we'll meet and we'll be reviewing all of the comments that were made. If there are questions that have risen, let me just give you an example, a concrete example. There may be an analysis of information. So one of the things we're interested in is, for example, how much immunity is there after one dose of a vaccine, as opposed to two, and do that in subgroups, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, those with comorbidities, younger people. And those are really important questions, because as we move forward, if there is an authorization and a vaccination program, we need to understand what would be the mechanics around that. So we know these are 2-dose regimens, several weeks apart. And so we need to ask that question. So that would be an example of something our scientists are diving into, but these experts may have additional questions about that, and we may need to go back and look at the data.
Julie, go ahead.
Dr. Hahn, thanks. Thanks, Jeff. So the UK authorized their vaccine, Pfizer's vaccine, this week. And there has been some criticism already that they went too fast. Did they go too fast? And what did they do in the UK, and what is the FDA doing here, and why is it taking longer to do?
Julie, I don't have insight into the exact process or the regulatory framework that the United Kingdom uses. What I can tell you is I know very well what ours is, and I know that we've been explicit since June and October about what data we need to see, and also about what our analysis process would be. I'm also aware of the data that we have, and it is very extensive. Just to give you perspective, data on a vaccine trial that has 44,000 participants would normally take us months to review. And I'm talking 4 to 6 months to review, because we'll go line by line in the data. What are the side effects in each population? So ethnic and racial minorities, in the elderly, et cetera. We'll go line by line and look at the effectiveness. We'll also go line by line on the immunologic response. And so the bottom line is it's very extensive data. It's not clear at all to me whether that same data set were given to the United Kingdom regulators. So it's difficult for me to compare and contrast, but I can give you complete reassurance that our scientists are all hand on deck, our statisticians, our pharmacists, et cetera, looking at this very complicated data set. Because all of you are having questions, and rightfully so. Is this vaccine going to work in certain groups? What about kids? What about pregnant women? And we need to make sure we know the data really well. And the other part of this is we're not just going to rely upon the conclusions of any one company. We're not going to look at a press release and make a decision. The people of America expect that we are the gold standard of safety and effectiveness assessment, and we're going to do that.
Yeah. Dr. Hahn, you've had a couple meetings at the White House this week. Are you feeling pressure from President Trump to speed this process?
Jeff, I'm feeling pressure from the urgency of the situation and the thought that we have a significant pandemic in this country. That's where the pressure is coming from, and I totally understand, including from the president, from the administration, from Capitol Hill, from the American public, the need for us to move expeditiously. And again, the promise we made to the American people is that we had a process we would go through. I don't want process to get in the way of saving lives, if in fact that's what we'll see with this vaccine. On the other hand, the American people do depend upon us to do this job right. And that is our promise. We will do this right. We'll get it right for the American people. And we'll look at the data very carefully so that they can have confidence in the decision we make.
And there's no question that it has gone really fast. And of course, people are impatient. Certainly, a lot of that impatience does seem to be coming from the White House, though. And I know you want to be careful about discussing that, but can you give us a sense of what your meetings with Mark Meadows were about and what you discussed?
Yeah, Mr. Meadows asked for a briefing, and we gave it, and it went very well. We had a very robust discussion, and I know that term sometimes is loaded, robust, but we did. Folks want to understand what it is about our process that takes the time that it does, but also to verify that we're doing what we need to do to make sure it's safe and effective. So it's this balancing act that FDA always does with all of its medical product reviews and decisions. And that's sometimes very complicated to describe. I mean, the questions you're asking me, Jeff, I probably answered about 100 times, and I probably need to answer them another 100 times because it is complicated. People don't understand. And for many years, FDA's decision-making has been a black box. And so we're trying to get out ahead of it as much as possible. And that's what happened here.
Is it realistic for the White House to say that 20 million people will be inoculated before the end of the year? Is that a realistic promise?
So I think given what we know about supplies, it is realistic. It'll very much depend upon the vaccination campaign and the final decisions of the CDC and Department of Health and Human Services about allocation. The other part of this is really important, is that I mentioned earlier the effect of one immunization versus two, and in what groups that will be seen. And so that could help guide some medical decision making as well. Again, I'm not prejudging any of the data, but you could imagine that decisions around this, particularly in the most vulnerable, would be important. And just one final point, we saw the Vaccine Advisory Committee for the CDC, what's called the ACIP, make some recommendations earlier in the week. So it's our job to make sure that we also look at the populations they're recommending be prioritized in the beginning part of vaccination to get to the goal that you're describing. And that's part of the data analysis we're doing.
And just finally on that piece, you said you had a robust discussion with Mr. Meadows. Did he understand the message that you gave him about needing to go through this process, even with the external pressure?
We'll have to ask him that question to be absolutely sure, but yes, I feel confident that he does.
Dr. Hahn, you just mentioned evaluating vaccines and how well they work after one shot or two. Is it possible that the FDA would consider recommending either of these vaccines after just one shot, or are you just looking to see how well they work in case people don't get their second dose?
Well, Julie, it's a really good question, and I can't prejudge what our scientists will decide, but we will look at that. And we will consider all options that are described by the data. We're going to be a data-driven organization. Now, these clinical trials were done with 2 shots. In one case, 21 days apart. In the other case, 28 days apart. Typically, not to prejudge, but typically the way they're given in clinical trials is how it flows into our authorization or approvals. But given what's happening in the country, given the questions that, and I'm sure you've seen that in the press from many of our medical experts asking that question, it is absolutely required of us to look at that. So not going to be able to give you an answer specifically to that, but just to explain the situation.
The president has accused the FDA of slow walking this vaccine approval process. The FDA did add a safety requirement, and we know that Pfizer and I believe Moderna too altered their study protocols so that they had more cases of COVID-19 before they did their interim analysis. So I'm wondering, does the president have a point?
So I think those are 2 separate issues, Julie. They're a really good question. They have to be separated out. So when a sponsor, and this is when a sponsor or manufacturer, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, that's the term we use. When a sponsor makes a decision about its clinical trial, that is something that we have insight into, but is made by the sponsor. And you probably have heard the CEO of Pfizer talk about that decision-making process. And when they decide to do their interim analysis is based upon accumulated cases of COVID-19, not adding people to the clinical trial. So it's what's called an event-driven trial. They need to see a certain number of cases before they can look, because then they're going to unlock the study and see how many cases were in the vaccine group and how many cases were in the placebo group. And in most clinical trials, and people don't know this, you usually get one shot at doing that. And if you do more than one, then you have to either wait to the end of the trial to do the analysis, or you have to, at that point, add more cases to the entire trial. So that was what was explained. And so that's the cases that they add is to look at the number of cases. Now, a separate issue is how much data did we need to see to ensure safety? Because I imagine one of your questions, hopefully I'll preempt it, is how can we ensure the safety of this vaccine? So, we took a very careful look at this. The WHO, for example, had one set of criteria of how long you had to follow people to look for safety. Our scientists went back into the literature, but also our experience around safety. When did we see the majority, an overwhelming majority of side effects and serious side effects from a vaccine? And that's where we came up with this criteria that we needed to see 2 months of follow-up in the median number of people who had come through the trial. And, we received criticism on both sides of this. And again, this is that balancing act that FDA does. Too little. Some people said it was too stringent. The bottom line is our scientists used a data-driven approach to say we needed to see median follow-up of 2 months of participants in the trial. Now, the other thing we said to the companies is you can submit when you want, because it'll take us time to look at it and the data can come in a rolling basis. So we did not want it to slow down any application process. So 2 separate issues, Julie, and I hope I explained that well enough.
You did. Thank you. And, you talked about criticism. So let's talk a little bit more about criticism. You took a lot of heat for the hydroxychloroquine EUA approval. And I'm just wondering, did you learn from that? And is the experience, how is the vaccine approval process different from the hydroxychloroquine?
So if you're going to ask me to talk about hydroxychloroquine, I will. I stand by the decision that was made by our career scientists at the time. And at that time, we had no therapeutics for COVID-19. Hydroxychloroquine was an approved drug for other indications. And for a variety of reasons, there was great pressure on supply. And people who had it or needed it for both clinical trials, but also for those approved indications, we were having trouble getting that through them. And so one of the reasons we issued the EUA was to make sure there was increased supply of donated drug. I think we can all recall back into that period of time and the pressure that the medical system was under. When we accumulated more data, we revised our decision. And Julie, this is like a doctor in the emergency room. You see a patient, you may not know that patient, but you're gathering the history really quickly. You're doing tests, you're looking at the data, and you need to make a decision based upon what you have in front of you to save someone's life. And you make that decision. The patient gets admitted, you get more data, you revise your decision. This is what FDA has done throughout. And we'll do it regardless of criticism. As you can imagine, we know that this is coming our way, and there's an appropriate and unbelievable amount of scrutiny, as there should be. So it's different from vaccines in the following. We have therapeutics now. We've gotten better at taking care of these patients. That's one. But there still is an urgency of the situation. And the way we're going to get out of this is to build herd immunity. So we definitely need a vaccine. But a vaccine goes into people who are well in general. They're not sick from COVID-19, right? And so the risk-benefit analysis that goes into any decision we make, hydroxychloroquine, vaccines, remdesivir, that changes. It's why we were very, very careful about the 2-month follow-up for safety, because safety becomes an even more important issue when you give a vaccine, because you're giving it to prevent COVID-19 and because there's a substantial amount of vaccine hesitancy in the country, and we wanted to provide that assurance. So there are a lot of things that I could point out, but the essential issue is we said there had to be clear and compelling evidence of safety and effectiveness or efficacy in a phase 3 randomized clinical trial to support the use of the emergency use authorization. And we've been very, very clear about that, and that's what we're using now. One final point, Julie. If our scientists make the determination that these vaccines should be authorized, I can tell you that when it's appropriate, I will be first in line and I will encourage my family to take this vaccine. I have 100% confidence in our amazing scientists.
Okay.
Dr. Hahn, can you explain for people, will this vaccine be approved for a broad swath of the US population, or will it be a more narrow approval?
Jeff, again, these are great questions. And the thing is, this is what makes the data analysis so complicated, because you can imagine we're going to be asked, or we have been asked questions, what about people with kidney failure? What about people with lupus? What about people with sarcoidosis? Other diseases, we're being asked this. So we've had to very carefully not just go through the data, which are de-identified, so we don't know the people, but what their medical problems were to be able to answer this question. So that's what our scientists are doing now. And that's what we plan to have a robust discussion about at the Vaccine Advisory Committee. And of course, our hope, because these clinical trials did have a great deal of diversity in them, and that was based upon our guidance to the manufacturers, our hope is that the decision would be generalizable. We thought back in June 30th, when we issued this guidance, we created that guidance with this thought in mind, because we said racial and ethnic minorities, people with comorbidities, heart disease, high blood pressure, elderly. We needed to make sure they were in the clinical trials because we knew that this was going to be an important question. So we'll do the data analysis, Jeff, and we'll hopefully be able to answer that based upon what the data show. But I can promise you this, Jeff, it's going to be a data-driven decision.
Okay, so you can't answer that now until all the data is in and has been analyzed.
That's right. That's right. You got it.
Speaking on another sort of semi-political issue, there's a transition going on to the president-elect's White House. Have you been in touch with President-elect Biden's team about vaccine distribution and development?
Well, they have not been in touch with me. All those conversations go through the Department of Health and Human Services. We wouldn't really be involved, or we aren't involved in vaccine distribution. But I'm very happy to provide information, as I am to you, about what's going on the vaccine authorization process, because I do think that's so important.
And I know Dr. Fauci, I think, had a meeting with them this week. Once that process gets sort of moved along, what can the FDA do to make sure that all the work you've done so far continues smoothly during this transition and under a new administration?
Well, we have been very carefully cataloging what we've done, the issues that we see before us at each of the medical product centers. So we've been very careful to keep track of that and to make sure that it's available to anybody that needs it, both internally and, when appropriate, externally. The other thing is we are in the very final stages of our what we call in prep, which is really an action review. What have we done? What could we learn? What can we do better? What should we keep the same? What should we do more of? And we're going to publicize that very soon. And we're going to provide all that information to everyone who's interested.
You know, Dr. Hahn, you just mentioned all of the groups that were included in these phase 3 trials, but one group that really hasn't been tested yet is pregnant women. And there are a lot of pregnant women or women of childbearing age who are healthcare providers. What do you advise those women on whether or not they should take the vaccine, because they're likely to be among those first in line to get it?
Well, Julie, as you can imagine, we've been asked this question quite a bit, and it's a really important one. So one of the things that we did in advising the sponsors of the clinical trials was to not require a pregnancy test prior to going on to the trial. So as you can imagine, if you don't do that in a clinical trial, it is very likely when you have 44,000 participants that someone will have gotten pregnant after receiving the injection. Now, again, I don't have those data in front of me, and I'm not going to prejudge them, but we will look very carefully at those data. Typically, in a situation like this, there won't be enough information to make that decision, and a separate study might need to be done. Again, I can't tell you that one way or the other, but it is, again, one of the things that we are very carefully looking at. The other group that we're carefully looking at as well is kids. So what if you're below the age of 18? And you probably know from publicly available data that the Pfizer trial included people from 12 to 18. So do we have enough data? And you probably also know from publicly available information that there are trials that are going to begin or have begun in this arena. So we want to make sure that we get that information, because particularly with kids, there is a possibility of causing this post-coronavirus syndrome, and we want to make sure we have enough robust safety data for our children.
Do you have any idea on timeline? When might you have data on kids, particularly younger kids?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, because although our pediatricians don't like it, the older kids sometimes react just like adults to medical intervention. But no line of sight onto the timeline. It'll depend upon accrual to additional studies if they're needed. But one of the reasons we really want to expedite looking at the data is to actually have some preliminary data, because that will inform the subsequent studies.
We're beginning to run a little short on time. So just in conclusion, to wrap things up, looking at next year, 2021, how do you see things playing out with the pandemic in this country? And what are your plans post January 20th?
So with respect to the pandemic, it is vitally important, so important, and I hope everybody hears this, that even if a vaccine is authorized this month and we vaccinate 20 million people this month, this virus is still with us. And the majority of Americans will not have been vaccinated as we move into the early parts of 2021. Now, we want to push the ramp up. We want to get as many people vaccinated if there is authorization. It is critically important that we take this seriously in the winter months, particularly as flu season comes upon us. We must follow those common sense mitigation recommendations from the CDC and the White House Coronavirus Task Force. So that is my plea. That's what I see moving forward. And I ask all Americans to be very, very vigilant and careful, protect the vulnerable. It's our obligation. And that includes the communities of racial and ethnic minorities that have been hit so hard by this pandemic. And my plans, I haven't made any plans yet. I've been laser focused on therapeutics and vaccines these last couple months, and will do so until my last day as Commissioner of Food and Drugs.
Once the vaccine is approved and distributed, it'll be a success story, no doubt, because it's gone so quickly. Who deserves credit for that?
Well, I think the nation deserves credit. President Trump deserves credit. The incredible private-public partnership deserves credit. Jeff, this is an amazing medical event if this occurs, and if we follow the path you just described. I've described it as a medical home run. This doesn't happen very often. I'm 30 plus years a doctor, and things like this happening this quickly and done this well without cutting corners is a remarkable story that fully needs to be told. But I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of FDA's participation, because early on we've been working with manufacturers to help speed the process, but make sure it was done well.
Is there anything we didn't ask you that we should have?
Well, we probably could go on for hours, but I don't believe so. Just again, I want to reiterate, I have absolute confidence, and I believe every American should have absolute confidence in the abilities of the FDA career staff. Everyone is working around the clock to make sure we do this as quickly, but as well as possible. And our promise is to get this right and uphold the gold standard of safety and efficacy for a vaccine.
All right. Well, Dr. Hahn, on my behalf and Julie's behalf and Reuters' behalf, thank you very much for joining us today, and good luck with the rest of this process.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Julie. You have a good day.
You too.